Hello everyone. My name is Paul Burt, and I am a technical product marketer at CoreOS here. And today we're going to talk to you about the 6 pitfalls of DIY Kubernetes. So DIY means do it yourself. We're going to talk about some of the challenges that pop up when you try and roll your own cluster. But first, we'll just talk about some of the cool parts of Kubernetes. So if you have any questions as we're rolling through this presentation, feel free to post them to BrightTalk, and I will answer them at the end of the presentation. Kubernetes is an orchestration tool for managing containers at scale. It makes it really easy to manage hundreds or thousands of containers from a single sort of interface. And some of the big benefits are that it's self-healing. That means Kubernetes is able to automatically restart a container if it crashes. It gives you run anywhere portability, which is particularly appealing if you like to keep your future options open, or if you have some infrastructure that is not on the cloud, some that is on the cloud, and you want to be able to run in both places. Kubernetes also makes it really easy to scale up additional clusters to handle more service. So Pokemon Go is a notable big user of this feature. When they first launched, they got 50x the traffic that they were anticipating. So they really needed to scale quickly, and Kubernetes was able to help them do that. And then finally, there's service discovery and load balancing, which is really important when you're working on a large code base. You need to be able to find stuff easily. So that's all great. That's why we all love Kubernetes. But the point of this presentation is to talk about where you run into trouble with a plain or do-it-yourself version of Kubernetes. So what's the big problem with running an off-the-shelf version of Kubernetes? The big problem is crowds. So it's what happens when you run into tens or hundreds of developers trying to coordinate on the same cluster and do things in tandem. You tend to need like role-based access control and auditing, specific logging and other sorts of knobs and tweaks that are really important. The other big thing is efficiency is a big component here when you're working across multiple people. Minor inconveniences or places where it's really easy to shoot yourself in the foot, means that you're more likely to get visited by some scary-looking folks at the office if something goes wrong than not. And with more people using it, it kind of becomes a statistical inevitability that something will go wrong as you're running on this cluster. So having some sane defaults and having some tooling in place to help with this kind of multi-user, multi-tenant issue is really important. So let's dive into the 6 big pitfalls we think you'll encounter when you use an off-the-shelf version of Kubernetes. The first one here is engineering dependency. So engineering dependency, as one, to paraphrase a New Yorker from many years ago, most systems, more problems. The more systems you're running, the more surface area, the more there is to manage for your team. So if you have a team of 10 people already running your systems, and you add another big component like Kubernetes on top of that, not only are you introducing more technical things that they need to learn, but you're also introducing more systems and components that need to be kept up to date. And with all of the new news that's been coming out about breaches and everything, it's a nice thing to have up to date. So some of the big challenges are doing new cluster turnups, so that's creating a new cluster. Keeping it up to date is probably the bigger, longer term thing. And then automating things like user management, permissions, all that good stuff that keeps every user on the cluster happy and basically allows you to operate from a principle of least privilege. So you're not giving your interns access to delete the entire cluster, that sort of thing. Everybody's kind of sandboxed into their own little space. The next big pitfall we'll cover is excessive risk. So we kind of touched on this talking about updates before. There's also risk in terms of the complexity of the system. So, recently at some events, I think Google Cloud Summit and Open Source Summit, Jim Zemlin, the executive director of the Linux Foundation, called Kubernetes the Linux of the cloud. And I think that's a pretty apt analogy. I think most of us like to use a version of Linux that has been tested well and works. We could compile our own kernel. It's not too hard. But we use this integrated, well-functioning version of Linux. And that's because integration testing is actually really hard. When you look at the complexity of Linux, most Linux distributions that we use are on 6-month or more type release cycles. So most of us tend to prefer distributions that have been well tested. Maybe they have best practices implemented from the start. And the same is true for Kubernetes. There's a lot of tooling like around monitoring, network policy, logging, all this stuff, key management. That's really valuable, but integrating that stuff yourself means you can run into trouble. So, having a well-tested and sort of battle-tested solution is incredibly valuable, I think. The other big thing that we sort of touched on in the front of this was the increased burden of maintenance. You have a small team, introducing complex technology can be a challenge. So, this is kind of one of my favorite items to reference. So in the recent months, you may remember around February 28th, earlier in the year, Amazon S3 was disrupted. And the cause for that, as you can see in the highlighted text here, was one of the inputs that a team member input was incorrect. They entered a command incorrectly. And this is not a knock on AWS or their team. They're incredibly talented. There's a reason we use their software, and they're very big in the industry. It's because they are really good. And this should really just drive home the point that anyone is sort of susceptible to this sort of thing. Human error happens everywhere. And because of that, at CoreOS, we tend to adopt sort of the software-defined infrastructure philosophy, similar to Google SREs, or a lot of other philosophies are floating around there that also kind of adopt this. But we think it's really important to encode as much as possible into the software for recovery and maintenance, and have things kind of predefined by the computer. It turns out if you give a human a bunch of instructions, they tend to improv a little bit, whereas if you give a computer a bunch of instructions that work, the computer will do exactly what you say. So that's kind of the advantage of this software-defined mentality. So this starts with Tectonic's one-click updates. It continues with automated operations on the cluster. If you have an enterprise distribution of Kubernetes, you want something that's able to recover from basic failure scenarios. So your engineers aren't getting woken up in the middle of the night to fix kind of trivial things. All in all, this works to reduce human error. So, just to add more clarity, that automated operations piece is something that Kubernetes is able to do for normal applications running on top of it, but it's not something most Kubernetes clusters are able to do for the control plane and the API server, other components that kind of manage the cluster and keep it running. So if one of those components that runs Kubernetes itself crashes in a traditional cluster, you have to manually intervene, and you run into this situation where you can make a mistake like this AWS engineer. We've built an enterprise version of Kubernetes that's able to self-heal in a lot of these common failure scenarios, so that's much less of an issue. Cool. The next big thing is ballooning costs. So this is a fun one to talk about, I think, just because there's a lot of misconceptions. So when you think about open source software, you may get a phase similar to this. You think, wonderful, open source is free. I'd love to use it for my business. And that lasts for about a week until you actually try to run the software, and you get into the details, and what you realize is it's free if your time isn't worth anything. This is a quote from Jamie Zawinski during the Netscape era. And I find that to be very true. So, you know, if we do kind of basic calculation, we look at team size by average salary, by the amount of time you spend, you know, maintaining, updating, wrestling with debugging issues that shouldn't be there. It can get pretty costly pretty fast. And this is sort of, it's tricky because it's one of those things that's hidden from view most of the times when we do our little mental calculation about what something's going to cost. But this is the sort of calculation you can do for your team. So these are obviously relatively simple numbers, so nice round numbers like 10, 100,000, 50% of work hours, that sort of thing. But you know, you could look at this, you could plug in your own numbers and see how this would affect your business just as easily. It's relatively trivial calculation. As a more concrete example, what we've seen is some customers who've started using Tectonic over a DIY or do-it-yourself installation have seen their update and you know, roll forward cycle go from 14 weeks of planning down to 7 hours. So you know, that's a significantly better story for them. Obviously, they're getting access to the newer, better features of Kubernetes a lot faster, which is great because Kubernetes has 4 to 5, you know, feature releases in a year generally. So there's a high velocity there, and it's wonderful when you can get the latest and greatest. And just to make this calculation make a little more sense, if we convert the weeks to hours, so we're comparing hours to hours, it's 560 business hours compared to, you know, 7 hours. So it's many hours composed over many weeks with many people. And this is all really the 7-hour kind of update cycle is thanks to the one-click update that, you know, Tectonic, which is an enterprise distribution, is able to do. So if you're using an enterprise version of Kubernetes, this is something it should be able to offer to you. And we think that this is really made possible by that one-click update where, you know, you have the team ready to be on call. You have CoreOS ready, you know, on the support lines, and you press the button and you just kind of monitor the nodes as they're brought down, drained, brought back up with the new software. And then once it's all complete, you know, everybody pats each other on the back. And another thing to kind of note here is this is kind of a classical domain for engineering issues. So, you know, it's easy to say it can't be that hard to administer something like this, but you look at organizations that have really been on the Kubernetes train since the first day, like Box or a couple other spots, and most of them even with the DIY Kubernetes solution, they've ended up bringing in, you know, consultants, analysts, folks to help them really get it humming, tuned well, that sort of thing. So they kind of end up paying the tax for the do-it-yourself cost at the end of the day, and they don't end up getting something as nice as one-click updates or the automated operations that you get with Tectonic. So it's a deferred sort of issue. You know, this is, I think, most succinctly stated as like any engineer could invent Facebook in a weekend. It's a simple, you know, you create posts, you delete posts, you read posts, you update posts. So that type of CRUD app is something that you could do easily in Ruby on Rails. But, you know, the difficulty with Facebook isn't in creating that feed with many different accounts. It's in doing that at the scale that Facebook works at and doing it well. And that actually turns out to be incredibly difficult. We think the same thing is true for most distributed systems like Kubernetes. It can be subtly simple at the surface, and then when you dig deeper, there's a lot of complexity there. Cool. Let's talk about catastrophic failures. Everybody's favorite subject. Well, It's everybody's favorite subject when it happens to someone else. No one's favorite subject when it happens to them. So we talked about this earlier. Automated operations mean that your cluster is able to recover from basic failure scenarios. So etcd acts as the brain of Kubernetes. It's the key value store / database that Kubernetes stores all of its information in. And if that crashes, your cluster obviously has a problem. With an enterprise distribution like Tectonic, you want something that's able to recover from basic scenarios. You want it to be doing backups for you. This is a critical piece of infrastructure, and there's a lot that needs to go into that to make sure it's working well. And when you look at most distributed systems sort of topics, what you'll realize is a lot of the discussion that goes on around there is about failure scenarios. So you look at CAP theorem, you look at high availability, any of those discussions, the meat of all of those is what happens when things break. Because at the scale of distributed systems, things breaking becomes sort of an inevitability rather than just an off chance. So with automated operations, you can rest a lot easier. The basic stuff is kind of taken care of for you. And for the harder stuff, we'll talk about that in a little bit. One important component to this is having a good monitoring story. So knowing what's happening with your cluster, being able to easily assess what's going on. And this is sometimes called observability these days. So, Tectonic in 1.75 released this nice dashboard that kind of gives you a heads-up display of what's happening with your cluster, which is wonderful. This is on top of the Prometheus monitoring that's already happening. And then there's also a nice Grafana dashboard that you can use to really drill into some of these stats as well. So if you're looking at an enterprise distribution, chances are you want something like this that gives you an overview of how your cluster is working. And if something does happen to go wrong that it's not able to automatically recover from, you're able to really dig in and find out what's happening quickly. So this, I think, is absolutely essential for anyone running anything in production, whether you're enterprise or not. Cool. And the last pitfall we'll cover today is just inconsistent support. So this is what happens if something goes horribly wrong with your cluster, maybe the automated operations doesn't automatically recover. Sometimes this is talked about as like Byzantine fault tolerance in more academic sort of circles. So those situations can be somewhat hairy. Kubernetes does offer community support. You do have access to Stack Overflow, but you're kind of at the whims of whoever is on the other end of that, and there's no real guarantee that you'll get a satisfactory answer to your question. And it's much more likely the more difficult your question is, the more unlikely it is that community support will be able to really come through for you. That said, I think Kubernetes does an excellent job. If you're not on the Kubernetes Slack already, I highly recommend joining that. There's thriving Kubernetes Reddit community, Kubernetes on Stack Overflow. Those are all great. Definitely use those. But for really hairy, really gnarly issues, that's not something you want your business to be dependent on. If you're a successful business, you're making hundreds of millions, tens of millions of dollars a year, then a day of downtime means potentially tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions, depending on the size of your business and the time of year, sort of damage to you. And that's not something most businesses want to stomach, is dealing with that sort of downtime. So let's take a look at one issue that we actually helped diagnose with one of our customers. They had recently moved some applications to a new cloud provider, and they'd spun up a new cluster. And what they found is they started getting some weird instability at sort of random times. So they called up CoreOS as soon as they noticed the problem, and we did some investigation. We realized that packets above a certain threshold were being dropped by the cluster, which was sort of strange. We thought it might have been due to an update that they had done recently, but As soon as we started investigating that, we saw some of the updated clusters start recovering, while some of the old out-of-date components that we were testing with started experiencing the same issue. So we thought that certainly couldn't be the problem. Did some more digging, and this was, an all hands on deck because sort of a weird issue we're encountering. So, our team from Container Linux collaborated with the team working on Kubernetes and Tectonic, and really dug into the issue. And what we found was that as soon as we disabled this, the transaction checksum offloading feature, which caused the kernel to perform the packet checksums instead of offloading it to the network, the problem totally disappeared, which was pretty crazy. So we just immediately enabled all of that after doing some testing. We saw that having the kernel do this increased CPU load by about 0.5%. Not a big deal in the long term if this is fixing some instability. And then we talked to the cloud vendor who previously had said, oh no, nothing's changed here. It's your problem. And asked them if they'd done any updates to the network card recently, and sure enough, how they were interfacing with the network card on their servers had gotten a driver update. So the cloud vendor was able to immediately start fixing that. And I think this really highlights what you can expect from really high tier quality support. An organization with a lot of experience with Kubernetes is you get to dig into things like this. And this is a very technical, very tricky sort of debugging topic. So I think this is something that could affect anyone. Your cloud vendor makes a seemingly innocuous update, and then they kind of shrug their shoulders when you say things aren't working, because there's no smoking gun pointed at them. So what a good enterprise software provider will do for you is help you hunt that down. They won't just shrug their shoulders and say, it's not our problem. They'll put a pot of coffee or make a mug of tea and really hunker down and get to work with you. Cool. So those are the 6 pitfalls, just to kind of wrap everything up and put a bow on it. Kubernetes is really taking over. In a recent Red Monk report, they noted that 54% of Fortune 100 companies run Kubernetes, and that that's across multiple different sectors and verticals. So it's a product that's obviously kind of taking things by storm. It's got, I've heard it called one of the fastest growing open source technologies ever, which I think is fantastic. But obviously we feel that this presentation, there's a lot of value to be added to that by making it robust, secure, something you can depend on. In the same way, you might have you might get a little sweaty thinking about compiling your own Linux kernel. We think the same is probably true for Kubernetes clusters as well. You want something that's been battle tested, integration tested, and has kind of stood up to some real traffic over time. So we think we're providing that with Tectonic. If you're interested in giving it a try, we've got coreos.com/Tectonic as a site, which has some links to download a local copy to run on your machine called Sandbox, or you can just get started running it on the cloud. Very simple, and we've got some excellent documentation around that. Cool. So I will pop over to view some questions now. Let's see. So first question I have here is, what about the pitfalls of using Tectonic and not being able to use your tagging schema? Tectonic requires tags, but AWS has count limits, long-standing show-stopping bugs, little activity in the GitHub issues. This presentation suggests that using StackPoint or Platform 9 or simply a cloud provider other than AWS rather than using Tectonic. I'm not sure about that last sentence, what you mean there. If you could clarify, that would be handy. Yeah, Tectonic is our example of an enterprise Kubernetes distribution, so that's what we're kind of sharing here. Yeah, if you're having issues with GitHub issues, if there's little activity there, send me an email. I can be reached at community@coreos.com, and I'd be happy to dig in on things for you. If you're a paying customer, then I highly doubt that that's the channel that is ideal for you to be engaging on. But if you're a community supported customer of Tectonic, because we do have a free version of it, there's a decent chance that you're running into basically the limits of that license. You're still getting community level support. But we can always do better on that front. So like I said, definitely send me an email. I'm community@coreos.com. And I don't know the answer to the issue with a tagging schema off the top of my head, but when I get your email, I can definitely dig into that for you. Does Tectonic support custom AMIs? I need an encrypted boot drive for compliance. At the moment, Tectonic supports Container Linux and Red Hat Enterprise Linux. We can look into other AMIs as well. But we don't support custom. And really that's just because what we mean by support is we've really truly tested it end to end. We know that we have a lot of confidence that it works well. Yeah, if you have a custom AMI that you would like to use, same deal, email community@coreos.com, and I'd be happy to relay that to the development team as something for us to look into. When will a version of Tectonic be available that has built-in support for Calico? Ships with flannel overlay now, but a lot of people are moving over to Calico for better networking without encapsulation. That's a great question. That's something that's on our roadmap. So in the releases that are coming out in the next couple of days or next couple of weeks, you should see some news around that. So keep your eyes peeled. It's definitely, I know, one of the top issues in our queue, which means it's one of the issues getting worked on right now. So whenever that actually gets released, it's probably up to the PM team. But I do know it's definitely a priority for them. So it should be coming out, in an upcoming release. When will a version of Tectonic be available that has built-in? Oh, nope. That's a question I already just read. Can Tectonic run without Route 53? For example, we have a requirement to run Capes on the AWS Gov Cloud. That's a good question. That's something I don't know off the top of my head. I do know that Tectonic requires you to have a domain name associated with your AWS account in order for it to work. That's just because we need to give you we need to create a subdomain on whatever domain that you want to run the cluster on. To give you access to the Tectonic web UI. I'm sure there should be some way to potentially work around that AWS Gov thing. So I would post something to GitHub issues. We've got a Tectonic forum on there. Or same deal, I'm happy to engage with you over email. If you email community@coreos.com, be happy to dig into that one for you. Guidance on upgrading to Calico yourself. That is a great question. I actually don't know off the top of my head what is involved with that beyond just a standard Calico sort of install. So that would be a great issue just to forward to one of the developers. Like I said, Tectonic Forums is a great venue for doing that. On GitHub, we also have an IRC channel, which you can get to on Freenode. I think it's #CoreOS. Yeah, and a developer should be able to help give you some information on that. I'd love to answer this off the top of my head, but I want to make sure I give you correct answer. So I'm gonna defer to one of our experts here. Tectonic installer does not allow me to set up multiple subnets in each AWS availability zone. Is this the same case with Enterprise Edition as well? It would be nice to have the flexibility to have more than one subnet per AZ. I think so, is the answer. So I know that this is, we have a ticket on this, on fixing this for upcoming releases of Tectonic, and I think it Similar, not as high priority as Calico, but it is a pretty big priority for us to span multiple availability zones in a convenient way. I know we do have some features that do allow us to span, some sort of setups that are multi-AZ, currently, it is something that needs improvement, and I know it is something we're working on. In general, Tectonic is built so that you have the full version of it. Effectively, there's really no extra features available in enterprise other than being able to scale to a really high number of nodes. That's the only place we really lock things down, and that's just because we think it's really important that you get to experience the full product when you try the product. We don't want to hamper anything or hamstring the product in any unnecessary way. This is great feedback. I'll relay it to our PM folks, and hopefully that'll help prioritize work on the multi-AZ story. But I do know that's something coming. Let's see. Can we add different agents like OSSec, SSM, AWS Inspector to the base OS AMI? That would be a great question for the Container Linux team. I think it might be possible. I know that there is a possibility to do some custom builds of Container Linux, but I don't know how that integrates with Tectonic off the top of my head. That's another question that I want to give you a correct answer on. You'd want to talk to one of those folks about that. We exclusively use CentOS 7. Do not want to use CoreOS as our OS layer. Is that supported? At the moment, we just support Container Linux and Red Hat Enterprise Linux. CentOS, that's a really good question. That's a piece of feedback I'll relay to our product and engineering teams and see if that's something that, since we already support Red Hat, might be trivial to add support for CentOS as well, because it's the same sort of family. So not at the moment, but put in a feature request. I'll put in one as well, and who knows in the future. Another question. Do you support a hybrid cloud environment, AWS plus private data center? Also, how do you deal with process consistency? We have our config management software to deploy case clusters and such. Would Tectonic break this process or work with it? Thanks. It's a great question. Yes, we do support hybrid cloud environments. We support AWS, Azure, VMware, bare metal, and that's a big part of Tectonic, is working across a lot of different domains. We think that that's a big part of the promise of Kubernetes in general, which is, that's the advantage of using off-the-shelf solution instead of sort of a cloud-provided solution. The clouds will lock you in. And we think it's really important to have that openness and freedom of action. We do configuration management slightly different than standard Kubernetes. So Tectonic installer comes with a Terraform installer. If you're familiar with using Terraform, you should feel right at home. If you're using some other type of configuration management, it may be a little different. There's also a web UI for installing Tectonic. You can use that. So that also makes it really easy to work. But I imagine if you're doing things on a CI/CD pipeline, you would want to use the Terraform-based solution. So check that out. I think it should be easy to work with if you have any issues. There should be some contact us forms for anyone using Tectonic that'll email our support and solution engineers to help you figure things out. Are multiple single AZ clusters better, but with a federated control plane? Is federation on the roadmap? Yes, absolutely. Federation is a big sort of emerging story with Kubernetes. There's a application utility, for those who aren't familiar, called kubefed that allows you to really simply spin up a federated cluster at the moment. I don't have any experience running federated clusters, so I'm gonna, defer to our engineering teams again to talk about whether multiple single AZ clusters are better or a sort of multi-AZ spanning cluster is better. I think the big things that you would consider there are the performance issues. How a distributed system stays in sync is through something like etcd. that runs something like the wrapped consensus algorithm. You need that consensus to operate in a consistent way, and the further you push those etcd nodes apart, the longer the delay there is between that consensus getting synced. So it probably depends on the performance characteristics of each of your clusters, whether it's better to do single AZ federated or multi-AZ spanning clusters. So that'd be something to talk about with a solutions engineer. You should be able to get in touch with them if you just click contact us on one of the CoreOS web pages about Tectonic, and they can give you some example sort of architectures for doing that sort of thing. But to answer the other question, is federation on the roadmap? Absolutely. Brandon Phillips, who's our CTO here, gets a lot of stage time, and he, I believe, he presented a little bit about federation at the previous KubeCon, and I know he's continued to do a lot of work with the group that's looking at that, the special interest group in Kubernetes. So that's definitely something that we have our eye on. We think that's a really important story for people who are running these multi-cloud hybrid kind of setups. Is there a free version of Tectonic? What are the differences? We're thinking of building private clouds with open source software. Yes, so Tectonic, as I mentioned earlier, you get everything with the free version as you get with the enterprise version. The only real difference is once you get to your 11th node in a cluster, you should be able to contact us and we can talk about actually paying for it. But if you're running a small cluster, and like small, I guess, is in quotes, 10 nodes of any size node, so you can use the beefiest machines you can find on the cloud, that'll still count as your 10. You get the full feature set of Tectonic, which is all the RBAC, all the role-based policy, all the network policy, key management, monitoring, all the good stuff kind of comes bundled in. Recently, CoreOS and Ticketmaster collaborated to bring AWS application load balancer support to Kubernetes. Why does this not ship out of the box with Tectonic as a preferred choice for Kate's ingress on AWS? That's a great question. So shout out here to Josh Rosso, who did some work on this with Ticketmaster and the talented engineers there. I think this is a common request right now when you create new ingresses or new load balancers on AWS. It'll kind of do one load balancer per service, which can get pretty costly pretty quickly. And if I remember correctly, this is a solution that sort of allows you to use one load balancer for a couple different services together, and that's really handy for cutting costs. I think a big part of this is just making sure we've got a good update, a good solid product. So with a big change like this, it's something we want well tested, and I know that this, along with some other big changes we've made for other customers, some leading auto manufacturers, we've done some custom patches for them that we'd like to get into upstream as well. I think that's all on the roadmap. It's just a matter of doing it delicately and carefully. But that's a good reminder. I'll ping the PM team about that. Let me copy that actually to pass that along. Cool. How can I tell if something is a production-ready Kubernetes distribution? It's a good question. I think the biggest signaler is that the company offers really detailed support for it. So, they're willing to, like I said, diagnose underlying network issues, that sort of thing. I think it's also in the feature set. It's something that has, good security policies in place and good just general access policies in place, so that, like I said earlier, your intern can't just come in and nuke your cluster on accident. And then the third thing I'd really look at, in addition to those other two, is just that it's currently sort of being battle tested by, or it currently has a length of experience with other large enterprises, other large deployments, to really speak to its name. Talk to those people. If they seem happy with it, there's a good chance that it's doing something right. It's kind of keeping the lights on, doing well. Whew. All right. That was a fun list of questions. That's it that I see on my screen here. So just wanted to say thanks to everybody for joining us today. And if you have any questions, like I said, there are a few in here that I directed to community@coreos.com. Send your notes and messages there, and I'd be happy to engage with you offline. Enjoy the rest of your Friday.